I finished up the Fury trilogy by Elizabeth Miles, so now it's time for another series wrap-up. I'm not really certain that this will be one of my longer wrap-up videos. This is mainly because when I was about 90% finished with the third and final book, I was thinking about the entire series, and it's kind of like, Emily is kind of passive in a story about herself, which led me to the conclusion that everybody was really passive in this series. Yes, people did bad things, which is what brought on the trouble, but as the series progressed, not one person did literally jack in order to help Emily's situation. But let me backtrack a moment by telling you about the individual events in the other two books. In the second book, we're introduced to the character of Skyler, who moved to Ascension following her mother landing in jail. To make a long subplot short, she was the daughter of a washed-up child pageant participant and the younger sister to one of those golden child daughters. After a lifetime of psychological abuse from her mother and sister, that basically boiled down to you'll never be skinny enough or pretty enough or talented enough, you'll literally never be enough. Skyler finally snapped. She broke the heels of her sister's shoes, which caused her sister to fall off the stage and onto some lights, which put her in the long-term care unit of the hospital. When Skyler moved to Ascension to live with her aunt, she decided that she could have the fresh start and be the girl she always wanted to be, which is basically to be the girl her mother wanted her to be and to be her older sister. And this is fine and dandy, but she quickly catches the attention of the Furies who surround her and encourage her to make bad decisions. A lot of reviews warned that Skyler was pretty irredeemable, and at first I was like, oh, it's not so bad, but then she stole a bunch of her aunt's jewelry to pay for cakes for a party, and then she put clam juice into Gabby's skim cream, which almost killed Gabby because of her shellfish allergy. She did get her comeuppance by way of a roof collapsing onto her head, but she didn't die and only survived to be a "here, I'm going to literally hand you the answers you seek" device to Emily in the third and final book. That was subplot B in the second book. What is subplot A? I finished reading Envy in the middle of July. It's the middle of August now. I can't begin to tell you the single plot relevant thing that Emily did, or literally anything that served any sort of long-term purpose. She moped around a lot about JD, who was under a long-term spell of the Furies. JD had no memory of what actually went down at the end of the first book and only remembers that Em ditched him to go make out with a random guy, said guy beamed JD over the head with a pipe. Emily hung around with Drea, who was Sasha's former best friend before she died. However, the worst part about Drea's subplot is that Drea's significance doesn't become relevant until the third book, which, well, let me explain. Drea was obsessed with the Furies because she believed that they were responsible for the death of her mother. Yes, it had looked like a suicide, but so did Chase's death. In the end, Drea randomly decides to do a ritual with Emily, but decides to do it at the school's spring fling dance. Why then, you ask? I haven't the foggiest. Anyway, things go horribly wrong. Drea accidentally starts a fire that engulfs the school's gym. Drea hits her head so hard that she dies. JD shows up at the last minute and carries Emma to safety. And then that's the end of the second book. And I hope that you can understand where I'm going about Drea's role being important in the third book when I tell you that she died in the second. Yes, that's right, folks. Drea is somehow more important after death than she was in life. In the second book, we're introduced to one of Drea's friends named Crow. Well, Colin Richards, but Crow is his nickname. He was a high school dropout and a musician, but at the start of the third book, he tells Emily that he has visions and he keeps having ones of her. He expresses a lot of grief that despite having had a vision of Drea in the fire, he hadn't been fast enough to save her. And you're like, great, having a prophet can be a great asset to a hero, which normally I would agree with you, but you do remember what I said at the start of the video about how every single character felt so passive in the story? Yeah, that. Despite Crow turning into a huge character halfway through the second book, his role in helping Emily stop the Furies was so irrelevant that he might as well have been removed. Crow gives Emily visions, but there is literally no purpose to them whatsoever. Anyway, the singular point that Crow was actually useful in the plot was to set an end date to when things would come to a head. Which, even then, I'm not sure why Em figured out that it was going to be then. And I'm not sure why Crow was needed for any of that either. He simply was, and this date was simply picked. But I'll circle back to this in a moment. JD was also introduced as a point-of-view character in the third book. The spell the Furies had over him was starting to get weaker and weaker, and he began to question what had actually happened that night. One day he gets a call from his little sister that she'd hurt herself practicing some cheerleader moves in the middle of the haunted woods. As dumb 13-year-olds do, I guess. A random Good Samaritan helped get Melissa home, but the person turned out to be Allie, one of the three Furies. JD gets mixed up with the three cousins after that and ends up going on a date with Ty. Now, Ty is the one who offered Emily the out at the end of the first book, and in the time since then, she's been slowly morphing her physical appearance to be closer to Emily. JD was confused when he first met Ty and mistook her for Emily, but upon closer inspection, he realized that it wasn't actually her. Please remember this for later, as it's going to come up again. But JD's sense of wrongness is set off when he's alone with Ty, and he warns Melissa to stay away from the cousins. Melissa had been eager to hang out with the cool college girls at first, but eventually confesses that she saw Allie peeking in through her second-story bedroom window, which freaked her out. She also wants nothing more to do with this. All throughout that, Em has randomly come to the conclusion that she's slowly turning into a Fury, and you're thinking, okay, so maybe you should do something about that. And despite the narration's insistence that she doesn't, which is again going back to my main theme. The characters of this book did literally nothing. They were bystanders in their own lives. There was this really random subplot where Ty kept trying to pass herself off as Emily. She went to the movies with Gabby and then later to a party of one of the football players was throwing. She drank too much, wore revealing clothing, and generally made a fool of herself before leaving right before Em showed up, much to everybody's confusion. Do you remember how I said that JD confused Ty for Em, but then realized his mistake once he got a better look at her? Yeah, that. Apparently everybody else is face blind or something to the point where they legit confuse the two of them. And it's not so much that I'm here for some invasion of the body snatchers kind of story, but this is literally never went anywhere. Much like a good 90% of this series, Ty was terrible and pretended to be Emily, but when the problem was resolved in the end, we never saw Em trying to patch things up with the people who thought she had gotten drunk and made a fool of herself at the party. Do you remember how I said that Drea was more useful after death than when she'd been alive? In the third book, Em finds evidence about Drea's mom's involvement with the Furies. She talks to Skyler's aunt and a random librarian who had been friends with the mom. However, it wasn't their explanation about what happened to Edie Pfeiffer that actually moved the plot along, but rather JD talking to Drea's dad, Walt Pfeiffer. While Aunt Nora and Hannah the librarian can provide some background context as to why Edie summoned the Furies, literally none of that is actually relevant to Em and her problem right now. But it was Walt who fully explained about what happened after Edie took her own life in an attempt to get the Furies to leave baby Drea alone. However, in the book's only attempt to put an actual roadblock in front of JD's search for answers, the Furies got to Walt before he can tell JD what he did to get them to leave Drea alone. Except not too much of a roadblock because he sends JD a letter detailing how he put his daughter into a literal ring of fire and it randomly chased the Furies away. JD reads this letter and randomly decides that in order to help Emily out, he needs to put Melissa into a ring of fire. I legit do not follow any of this logic because by this point even JD knows that the Furies are only using him and Melissa to try and get at Emily. In the second book, Emily had gotten a book on the Furies from Sasha's locker. It was somehow the most useless plot device ever and only spelled out things for those who were super slow. Literally, the only thing of value that the book added was that it said that sometimes people with head injuries picked up the signals of the Furies. Which, good thing that we've introduced a character with a head injury. And you might be thinking that it's Skyler who took half of a roof to her noggin, but no. It's her sister Lucy, who was randomly brought up from Florida. That's right, guys. Yet another character is introduced simply to be the worst plot device ever. Anyway, randomly finds Lucy eating flowers in Aunt Nora's garden and talking about the albino will cure them, and then making some stretches that not even Elastigirl would attempt, and breaks into the community greenhouse and finds that Nora has been breeding albino orchids that only bloom under a full moon. Even more stretching, and Em decides that these albino orchid seeds are going to stop her from turning into a Fury, which is tonight, the night that Crow told her would be the night that everything comes to the head. How convenient! Anyway, so Em goes to the Fury house in the middle of the haunted woods. Unknown to her, JD brings Melissa out there too and starts to set his own sister on fire. But a random tree branch knocks Melissa out and JD is too distracted by Crow's appearance to literally save his own sister from burning to death. And also by Ty being there, whom he randomly mistakes for Emily. Because of course he does. By the time Emily gets out to the garden, well, community fans will think about the now famous Troy's Darkest Timeline scene. There's a fire, Melissa is almost dead, Crow and JD are trying to kill each other, and Ty is there holding up an albino orchid. Emily knows that she's the only one who's going to be able to save Melissa, so she goes into the fire. There, in the ring of fire, she thinks about all the people she loves, including romantically, platonically, and her parents. And in the stupidest ending that I've seen in at least a couple of months, the power of love was what broke the curse. Ty disappeared, as did the Fury house. Melissa was okay and was no longer turning into a Fury. And then that's it. That's the end of the trilogy. Em patched things up with JD, and they become a couple. Crow went on to have a song on the radio. Zero mention of Skyler, Lucy, Nora. If Em managed to patch things up with Gabby and the other popular kids in school, it was like the author was bored with her own story, but she got bored with it in the first book. A random aside before I close out the video, but some people might be wondering about Zach. He did move away, and both Gabby and Emily were intent to keep him in the past. There was one random throwaway line about how they'd heard that he'd been hurt and couldn't play football anymore, but both girls didn't want to know any details. And it's not so much that I'm angry over the motivations of the girls wanting to not hear any news about the cheating cheater who cheats, but from the perspective of the readers, what a miserable thing to do! You can't tease us like this and then give us nothing. I thought that there would have been at least a short story explaining a little about his revenge, but no, nothing. The readers will literally never know what happened to Zach. Overall, this series was miserable, poorly written, and full of terrible people who couldn't even be bothered to lift a finger to help themselves out. It was incredibly forgettable, as I indicated by how I literally forgot half of the second book in less than a month. Come next month, I doubt that I'll remember having read this series at all.